Good morning to all.
Good
My
morning,
name
sir.
is Banu Vijayaratna. We will be now. I know that you all have started this Diploma in Compliance program, and we are going to start up a new module today. We'll be starting up with creating compliance culture and the role of compliance officer, which will be followed by the corporate governance part, which I'll be handling. And today we are starting, as I mentioned to you, on the creating a compliance culture within the organization with a better focus on the role of compliance officer. Only thing is I have a technical issue, so I will be sharing the screen, but then my picture will go off the screen. You will hear the audio. If you have any issues, you can raise your hand, or when I interrupt, you can interrupt me and raise your questions then and there. Right. Just to start up and to understand the audience, can I request the participants to unmute their mics for a minute and then tell the name and the organization which he represents, and also briefly the area that he or she handles in the organization. So that will help me to understand the audience so that I can pitch up my presentation to suit the audience the best. Can I start? Because only thing is this technical limitations. Sometimes we might not be able to see each other, but never mind, we need to go ahead. So if you could just start up introducing yourself, just a brief introduction, your name, organization, and the area that you represent within the organization. Can I request Jehan to start up? I will not be naming thereafter. Please go ahead and just tell who you are and tell me what area that you represent in the organization, or rather you cover up in the organization. Jehan, Hemal, from
Good morning,
Inter.
sir. I'm Hemal Sandakalam Kankanamge, working for People's Bank as internal auditor.
Okay, thank you, Hemal. All the best. Yeah. Next participant, please.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I'm Johan Silva. I'm working for Commercial Bank of Ceylon PLC, and currently I'm attached to Logistics Department.
Logistics. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Next participant, please.
Good morning, sir. I'm
Good morning.
Bhashini Karyavasam, currently working for Merchant Bank of Sri Lankan Finance PLC, attached to Compliance Department.
All right. Good, Bhashini. Next participant, please.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning,
I'm
sir.
Chandilo Mendes, working for Asset Line Leasing Company, attached to the Compliance Department.
Compliance. Okay. Right.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
My name is Lalit Gunawardana, working for Ceylon Bank at internal audit department.
Okay. Good. Next participant, please.
Good morning, sir. I'm Isuru Kumarage. I'm working for Orient Finance, attached to Compliance Department.
Compliance. Okay. Right, Tisuru. Next participant, please.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I'm Bandara, working for Het National Bank and currently attached to Private Banking Division.
Private banking. What's your name? You said Hasita, is it?
Darshana Bandar.
Darshana Bandar. Right. Okay. Right. Move on, please.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
I'm Pasan Fonseca, working at AMW Capital Leasing, attached to Operations Division.
Operations. Okay. Move on, please.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I'm Yasin Tekanayaka, working for Commercial Bank, attached to Travel and NFC Department. I'm handling outward remittances.
You're handling outward remittances. Jacinta. Okay, Jacinta.
Good morning,
Next.
sir.
Good morning.
I'm Mekala Sudasinghe. I'm working at Ceylon Bank attached to compliance department.
Okay, Mekala. Thank you. Move on.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I'm Dushanti Madhampitiya, working for the Finance PLC attached to the Compliance Department.
Compliance. Okay. Okay.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I'm Sachira Jayasinghe, working at Nation Trust Bank in Compliance Department.
Sachira from NTB Compliance. Okay. Move on, please. Next participant. Is that all? Yeah. Okay. As per the screen that yes, go ahead, please, Pramita.
I'm Pramita Dulari, working Bank of Ceylon attached to the Personal Banking and AML Officer Department.
Personal Banking and AML.
Yeah.
You have both together. AML division attached to Personal Banking?
Personal Banking Officer and AML Officer.
All right. Okay. Right. Thank you. Thanks, Pramita. Right. Yeah.
So I'm Jehan
Anybody else?
Sankara, working for Commercial Bank, attached to the
Yeah.
Risk Management Department.
Okay, Jehan. Thank you.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
I am Nirushan Andasena from Ceylon Bank PLC, attached to Branch Operations Department.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Nirusha. Yeah. Anybody else? Right. Okay. It looks like, as per the screen that I have, there are about 14 plus few here, maybe about 20 participants logged in. I'm told the entire batch comprises around 80 participants. So I would make an appeal and a request to all the participants to kindly join the lectures, because what you find in the note or the handout is just a sketch of it, and we'll be discussing comprehensively the subject matter in the lecture program when the lecture is delivered, right? So please advise your friends, if they are not here today, to make it a point to join the sessions, because then it will be very much beneficial. That much I can assure, because this is a diploma program, and when you come out as a diploma holder, probably your employers and your colleagues would want a better product from you. So it's getting your qualification is one aspect, but mainly it has to be the development of knowledge, skills, and your expertise in the area of compliance. So it is important that we listen to the lectures, take part in the assignment. I think it's very important, and I'm sure you are right now pretty aware of the structure of your examination paper, and you are given 30 marks for the assignment and 70 marks for the sit-down paper. So the assignment, what I would want you to do, after a couple of lectures, we will group you into maybe 3 or 4 falling in one group, or it could be even 5, and thereafter an assignment will be given. So it's going to be a group assignment where you will have to do a little bit of research work and prepare your assignment, and it has to be supported with an executive summary or a synopsis, and then fairly a document that could run into about 2,500 words, and thereafter there will be a presentation. So that's how we move on, because the subject matter in this program is not so comprehensive to cover up all the work that's handled in a compliance department. And if I put it the other way around, if you are working in the compliance department, if you are into the compliance area, it's a important thing that you need to know the banking operations to some extent, if not in full. At least some idea needs to be with you if you are to be a successful compliance officer, because your job is to support the business keeping in line with the regulatory requirements. So therefore, we will have certain topics taken to cover up the balance part of it, so that you will be given a full understanding onto the area that needs to be covered in a compliance in a bank and a non-bank. So because I find there are employees from banks as well as from non-banks taking part in this program. And also I see there are participants coming from compliance, from internal audit, from risk, from operations, from private banking, and it moves on, right? Mainly from compliance, and there are other staff members, certain participants representing or handling other area of work in their respective organization. So it's a kind of a mixed audience where this type of group work will help you to share your knowledge, share your experiences, so that we will, end of the day or end of the program, the idea is to have a complete product who has a fair knowledge on compliance and what you should do in your organization. So having said that, I will move on with my presentation. So you might not be able to see me on the screen. We will go through. Hope you have received your PowerPoint presentations, right? So I would recommend you to make your notes on each slide that we are discussing, because what you find in the slide is not good enough to make a comprehensive answer for the examination paper. There are lots of things that we are going to discuss, the practical experiences, the practical problem, the challenges that you are going to face across, all that will be there. So therefore, I strongly recommend and suggest that you make your own notes when the lecture is being delivered. That's exactly why I said and encourage all the participants to take part and listen to the session and clarify your doubts if there are any as we go on, or probably maybe at the end of the session or whatever it is. Right. Okay. So let's move on. Then I'll start sharing my screen. Right. Okay. And in my session, I'll be just talking to you. I know there are limitations, everybody can't talk, but at least I would like if one or two can unmute your mics and then answer the questions or, acknowledge what we are discussing. So it will help us to make the session much more lively one, rather than it being a one-way process where I'll be talking to you 4 hours. It's going to be boring for me and you all both. So let's do it that way, and take liberty to unmute your mics. Even if you have a query, I give you that liberty to unmute your mic and interrupt and ask me the question, or you can even raise your hand. But I don't know, with this technical limitations, I'll be able to see as I'm sharing the screen. I probably might not be able to see your hand raises. So therefore, I give you that freedom to, you can unmute your mic and make your questions or the clarification, so that I'm more than happy to clarify them as we go on. Can we agree on these ground rules, please?
Yes.
Yes, you can answer. Somebody
Yes,
can
sir.
mute.
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. So we will move on. So as I mentioned, our topic today is creating compliance culture and the role of compliance officer. And as I mentioned, I am Bhanu Vijayaratna. I worked for Het National Bank for long years, then did a spell after my retirement with Union Bank, and thereafter I had my providing my services to a non-bank financial institution owned by Het National Bank. So that's a little bit in a nutshell about me. And I got to know who you are in the audience, so we'll move on. So we are going to talk about compliance. What is compliance? What do you mean by compliance? These are very heavily and very commonly used word, compliance. We have to be compliant. Bank needs to meet the compliance requirements. What do you mean by compliance? So I'm to define on it. Compliance can be defined as conducting business in accordance with established guidelines, rules, and regulations, and the specifications. So in other words, compliance means you got to run your business or carry out your business operations in a compliant manner, which goes in line with the established guidelines, established rules, and the regulations, and it could be various specifications by the own organization, right? So in order to elaborate this, we know the compliance can broadly be classified into two segments. What are these two segments? The compliance with external rules and the compliance with internal controls and procedures. Two segments. Please take it very important area. The compliance can be broadly classified into two segments. One is you are complying with the external rules. Now, who can issue the external rules? When you say external rules, it includes the meeting the applicable legal and regular requirements as well. So the external rules we know, as we are bankers and then the employees of the non-banks, the external rules are generally and commonly issued by the regulator. Regulator issues rules. Regulator issues guidelines. Regulator can issue determinations, directions. So there are different meanings in these words. Direction, guideline, and maybe certain consultation papers. You need to know as we move on, right? If you are not clear, you can ask me. But all in all, the external parties issue external rules, mainly the regulator. So the regulator can issue guidelines. You know, the main regulator in the banking area is the Bank Supervision Department. When you consider non-bank financial institutions, it is a non-bank NBFI, Department for Non-Bank Financial Institutions, similar to the Bank Supervision Department. And within central bank, there are other departments which also regulate certain functions handled by banks and non-banks. Those days we used to call it the Exchange Control Department, right? Then you have the FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit, within central bank, right? Bank Supervision Department. But you go outside the central bank, the SEC, Security Exchange Commission, CSC, Colombo Stock Exchange, right? Even the Institute of Chartered Accountants, they also issue rules and regulations in connection with the financial reporting, preparation of accounts. So all these are external regulations that are issued by external parties. So now, when we talk about compliance, I told you it's broadly classified into two segments, complying with the external rules and regulations, right? Now, we got a fair idea of as to what these external rules that are imposed upon banks, right? And it can come by way of a direction. Direction means you have to obey. I mean, there's no tolerance. When there's a direction by central bank, you need to fully comply with it. Any deviation would be treated as a non-compliant and a violation, right? So if it's a guideline, still you have to follow the guideline, but you know, it's a guideline. So you can take it as a guideline or some kind of a you know, certain information given for you to frame your internal procedures, but it is not as strict as a direction, right? Then they issue rules from time to time, right? Now, if you take the FIU, they issue their directions and also they issue rules, minimum rules to be met by the financial institution in meeting the AML CFT regulations, right? So you have guidelines, directions, rules, specifications, and all that issued. In addition to that, there are laws passed by the legislature, the lawmaking institute. What is the lawmaking institute in Sri Lanka? It is the parliament. Parliament makes laws, right? Sometimes the regulators use those laws to issue their directions. So the external regulations also, it can stem from the laws passed by the legislature, parliament. Example, the Financial Transaction Reporting Act, you would have learned under Mr. Rupa Singh, FTRA we call it. Then you have another law, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, which is the law of the land, right? Then you have Convention on Suppression of Financing of Terrorism, Act number 25 of 2005. PMLA, Prevention of Money Laundering Act number 5 of 2006. FTRA, Financial Transaction Reporting Act number 6 of 2000. So these are laws. So you got to fall in line with the laws also. Then you have the Banking Act, very old one. Then you have the Exchange Control Act, very old one, which have been revised several times. But the base document runs into ages. So these are the laws passed by the parliament. So you got to fall in line with these laws. The other part of external regulations, which comes by way of directions, guidelines, and various other rules, minimum rules, and all that, it is based on those laws passed. It could be based on mainly based on the laws issued or rather passed by the parliament, and it could be based on the industry best practices, time-tested procedures, right? So those are external ones. Then we'll move on to the internal one. What are the internal rules and procedures? I'm sure you are pretty aware of, you have your manual of operation. Then you have various circulars and guidelines issued by your organization from time to time. So the compliance with internal rules and procedures, right, are to facilitate compliance with the provisions of external rules and regulations. What does it mean? What does it mean? Internal rules are issued based on the external rules issued by the regulator or the lawmaking institution. You take any of your internal circular, if you analyze and see, you will see the base or the primary document which paves the way for that circular to be issued. Even the manual of operation, they are based on the external rules and regulations, right? Now you take the bill of exchange. We know in the banks, right? We know what to do when a check is presented. It's a bill of exchange. It is governed by the Bill of Exchange Act, but based on it, the banks issue various rules and regulations. Example, you say savings accounts. Checks cannot be collected to savings account unless it carries the authority or the authorization by the manager. What is the base of this? it goes and connects to the Bills of Exchange Act, Section 82, which provides protection to the bank under conversion. I'm not going to touch on those. I'm just bringing an example for you to understand. The internal rules and regulations are stemming from the external rules, right? So you have two sets of rules and regulations within the organization, external and internal. External ones, it is very clear, it was either the laws passed by the parliament or the regulations issued by the directions issued by the regulation. The internal ones are stemming from those external regulations, which comes to you by way of your manuals, internal circulars, procedures, so on and so forth. Are we clear on this point? Can somebody
Yes,
answer,
sir.
please? Okay, right. You need to be extremely clear on it. So compliance is meeting those requirements in these external and internal regulations and carrying out your business in accordance with that, right? So that is compliance. Now, when I say it is compliance, you have to meet the provisions of the internal and external regulations, rules, procedures, and all that, laws and all that, right? Who is supposed to do this? Now we say, yeah, most of you all are from compliance department. So you have the responsibility to, okay, we will understand it as we go on in detail. Now, initially, we all agree that compliance is to fall in line with the rules and regulations, internal and external both. Now, the question is, who is responsible for compliance in an organization?
All the employees of the organization?
Sorry?
All the employees of the organization?
Yes, you are right. What's your name, please?
I'm Darshana.
Darshana. Yes, you are right, Darshana. Who is responsible for compliance in an organization? So we will analyze and see. But how do you get all employees to comply with this? What is the reason why we are having a compliance division? What is the reason why we are having a compliance officer? What is the reason why we are having compliance policies, procedures, and so on and so forth? Your answer is perfect. It's correct. The responsibility of carrying out business or carrying on business in a compliant manner is applicable to all employees within the organization. Answer is perfect. But how do we do this? How do we do this? That we will understand. So who is responsible for compliance in an organization? The role of compliance is not just the responsibility of those performing the functions, but also that of its employees and managers. This is very clearly stated. Right? The ultimate responsibility, at the same time we say, it lies with the board of directors and who must set the tone from the top. Very important words here. So this is just one small single sentence. There are lots of very valuable inputs that you need to take into your minds and the hearts if you want to understand this subject better. Now, the role of compliance is not only the responsibility of the people who are performing the function. So who is performing the compliance function on the face of it? Who is performing that? The compliance department and the compliance officer, correct? Right. So then one might get the feeling that it is the responsibility of the compliance officer or the compliance department to comply with all these rules and regulations. It's not the case in practice. They will probably, not probably actually, they will make sure that the organization and all its employees carry out the business functions or the operations in a compliant manner. Right? At the same time, you know, in an organization, you have the employees, then you have your managers, the line managers, then you have maybe the department heads or whatever you may call it, depending from organization to organization, right? And then you will have your senior managers, then the corporate management. Above that, you have the board of directors, right? Now, in theory, it said the ultimate responsibility for compliance lies with the board of directors, right? You know, even if there's a compliance breach in a remote branch in a bank or a non-bank financial institution, the final responsibility, depending on the severity of the issue and depending on the nature of the issue, it can be the board of directors who is going to be answerable for that. So therefore, we say the final responsibility in compliance lies with the board of directors. And there's a very important term here, who must set the tone from the top. Who must set the tone from the top? What do you mean by the tone from the top? What do you mean by the tone from the top? Can somebody answer me if you know that? Tone from the top? What does it mean? Tone from the top is, we say the compliance function is a top-down approach. Top-down approach, right? I would say compliance is just a kind of going to be a dream if the tone from the top is not there. What does that mean? In simple terms, if a bank is to handle its business in a compliant manner, it has to come from the top, and the top blessing from the top is a must. Right? Blessing from the top is a must. When I say top, starting from the board of directors, and it can even, it will flow, come down through the managing director, CEO, then the corporate management, and it has to flow step by step, and then only the real compliance can be met within an organization. That is why it is said the board of directors must set the tone from the top. Right? So, how do they do that? How do they do that? How can the board of directors make sure that the entire bank or the financial institution carries out their business in a compliant manner? How do they do that? What's the mechanism? Can the board come and intervene into a branch operation and make sure that the business is run in a compliant manner? Is it practical? No, it's not practical. But what is the mechanism that's there in order to do this? The mechanism is the bank policy on compliance, the bank policy on various other areas that is covering the banking operation. The policy level formation and the approval of policies needs to be done by the board of directors of the bank, by the board of directors of the non-bank financial institution. Right? What does that mean then? So the responsibility lies through this mechanism, where it's the responsibility of the board to make sure that the policies are in place. The policies are in place which will support or pave the way for the rest of the staff within the organization to carry out their duties in accordance with the, go back to the basics, external and internal rules and procedures. right? Now, you know, internal procedures stem from the external procedures, external rules and regulations. So the board needs to make sure that there are policies within the bank, right, which provide the platform to carry out business in such a way that the business would be carried out in accordance with the given policy, which is approved by the board, taking all the requirements of the external regulations, all the laws of the land in performing the functions of the bank. Right? Now, the question arises, how many policies are there in a bank? How many policies are there in a bank? How many policies are there? There are a large number of policies. Can somebody name few policies that we have in a bank, especially the student from the compliance department or the internal audit? There are from risk. I saw there are even operations. There's a good mixed audience here. Can some of
AML
you all
safety policy and procedures.
come again, please?
AML CFT policy and
Yes,
procedure.
yes, very
Then,
right. AML,
then
CFT, compliance policy.
compliance charter.
Okay, compliance charter. Yeah, correct.
Risk management
Any other
policy.
area? Yeah.
Risk management policy. Integrated
Risk
management policy.
management policy. Yes. What are the
PEP
other
policy.
ones? Sorry?
Political exposed persons policy and
Yeah, PEP
procedure.
policy. Yes, politically exposed persons policy, the credit policy, the treasury policy, the recovery policy, right? That, you know, there are a whole heap of
FD and
policies.
savings.
Come again?
FD and savings policy and procedure. Fixed deposits.
FD and savings, yes. Okay, so you can have policies and procedures. So understand now, the entire audience understand. There are a whole heap of policies within the bank, in a non-bank, right? Now, if it is a policy, now some of these things are policies, some of these things may not be policies, but the secondary level documents, which just, you know, provide some outline framework like manuals and things like that. But if it is a policy, which are large in numbers in a bank, it is a must that all the policies need to be approved by the board of directors, right? I think those who are handling these policies or those who are very familiar with the operations of these policies would understand this better. Every policy, before it is implemented or put into practice, needs to be approved by the board of directors. So therefore, once it is approved by the board of directors, the requirement of the policy needs to be implemented, right? The board, now remember we mentioned the board is responsible for compliance at the primary. So primarily, the ultimate responsibility we discussed lies with the board of directors in carrying out the operations of the bank or the NBFI. And now we are trying to understand the mechanism or the chemistry that is being used within the banks, how to get this done. And at the same time, we discussed the board member can't go and supervise what's happening in a branch, whether the KYC is taken, right? Whether the, you know, how the checks are being taken into accounts, right? Whether the bill of exchange provisions are being met. It's impossible for them to do, but finally, if it's a policy level requirement, then remember, ultimate responsibility lies with the board. How they do that is, they formulate the policy and then approve the policy, and thereafter it is pushed down for the rest of the staff, starting from the managing director downwards, to implement the requirement of the policy. Right? So it is pushed down to implement the requirement of the policy. How do you do this? How do you do that then? That is done by way of having the procedures to meet the policy requirement. Correct? Okay, now your AML policy will say that all customers will be screened against the sanction list or before onboarding, or the minimum KYC would be taken from every customer that's going to be onboarded, or continuous due diligence will be done for every customer, depending on the risk profile of the customer at different intervals, right? So the policy says that. But how do you implement that? There has to be a procedure put in place for the rest of the staff to follow, through which the policy requirements are made. So can I propose and suggest that the internal procedures should be there in place to meet the policy requirement, provisions of the policy, right? Now, all these are connected. Remember, we initially said two sets of requirements, external, internal. External, we said laws, regulations, and all that. Internal, we said the internal procedures are stemming from the external, right? Now we understood there are policies. Now we are discussing the requirement to have effective procedures, comprehensive procedures to meet the policy requirement, which are known as internal procedures. Again, needs to be compliant with, or we have to be compliant to those, right? Then the board sets the policy, the management implements the policy by preparing or introducing the internal rules, regulations, procedures, circulars, manuals, so on and so forth, in order to meet the policy requirement. Right? Is it clear up to this point? Right. So the compliance with internal controls and procedures which are established to facilitate compliance with the provisions of the external rules and regulations is the mechanism to put the policy requirements in place, right? So our question was, who is responsible for compliance in an organization, right? So the most financial institutions face the challenge of ensuring that their activities are compatible with the regulatory obligation, right? So how to overcome this issue? How to overcome this issue? If you don't do that, right, the bank will be liable for compliance risk. What do you mean by compliance risk? Compliance risk, can somebody answer? We talk about compliance and we talk about the compliance risk. What is compliance risk? Can somebody give it a try? Especially our friend from the compliance division. What is compliance risk? The compliance risk is nothing but the risk of legal and regulatory sanctions, right? Which should also include the financial or reputational losses that could occur due to failure in complying with laws, regulations, rules, internal rules, and industry-based and standard good practices. Remember, all these things will come together. So basically, what is compliance risk then? If you are asked to define compliance risk, right? If you are asked to define compliance risk, you need to very clearly mention the compliance risk with the risk of legal and regulatory sanction, right? Legal risk and the regulatory sanctions, which also include, or rather with that, if you don't meet it, that can end up with creating financial losses and reputational losses as well, right? The banking business or the business of finance, banking or the non-bank, we are dealing with all kinds of risks, right? What are the risks that we are always dealing with in our day-to-day operation? Can somebody tell few risks? Banking business is dealing with risk. If you are not prepared to take risk, you cannot do banking. You cannot do the non-bank financing. So what are the risks that we have around us in this organization or in the industry of banking or the non-bank financing?
Marketing risk.
Marketing risk, okay, right.
Operational risk.
Operational risk, good.
Reputational risk.
Okay, reputational risk, good.
Credit risk.
Credit risk, yes.
Liquidity risk.
Legal risk, yes.
Liquidity risk.
Liquidity risk, yes, good.
Structural risk.
Sorry? Somebody was trying to say something. Okay, never mind. So now we are very clear that we are having all sorts of risk around us, starting from credit risk, the operational risk, the market risk, the foreign exchange risk, the liquidity risk, the capital risk, the reputational risk, the AML, the AML safety, the legal risk, all kinds of risk. So it's a question of managing the risk. And let me put it this way: if you are not prepared to take risk, then of course you will not have any good future within the bank. So you have to take risk, because everything that you do in a bank, remember, there is a risk, right? Okay, the risk is always associated with your revenue or the return. This is a general norm, right? High risk, high return. Low risk, low return. And no risk, obviously no return. If you want a return in the industry of banking, there's a risk that you need to take, right? So, okay, mostly we have the credit risk. So what is in credit risk means, what is credit risk then? What is credit risk? Risk of the money that you lend not being able to recover. That is, in simple terms, credit risk is that, right? So at the same time, I said high risk, high return, low risk, low return, no risk, no return. So this risk is associated with various products, your business functions, the business channels, the delivery channels, and different environment. The risk varies, right? So you need to take risk in carrying on business. Now, what is the in credit risk, the lowest risk when you are granting credit? There's somebody from the private banking. We have cashback facilities. The risk is very less because you are holding cash. That doesn't mean that it has no risk. It has risk, right? Suppose you grant it, so you're keeping a 1 million deposit. Probably you may grant 800,000. Then you have your capital, there's a buffer. But if the amount is not paid, and if you don't go and recover it in time, it will accumulate interest. And the moment it goes beyond the capital that we are holding as security, then there's credit risk. There's credit risk, right? So the risk is very marginal or minimal or close to zero granting against it. So therefore your return is less. Probably you may get 1.5% or 150 basis points over and above the FD rate that you are paying. for a cashback facility, or it could be 2% or 2.5%, whatever it is. Very less margin. But what is the highest, most revenue earning credit product that we have in the bank, and one of the most popular?
Overdraft, TOD.
TOD, very famous, and everybody wants TODs, right? But the banks are very reluctant to give. Why? It's a high risk, extremely high risk product, right? So if you grant a TOD, the return is very high. Okay, return is very high. So therefore, banks have various rules and regulations that governs the granting of credit, right? So the point that I'm trying to say is, everything that you do in the bank, the risk is available, risk is present. So in your opinion, having all kinds of risk around us, what is the important most risk that you need to have in the back of your mind or be focused in doing banking or non-bank finances? Out of all this, all risks are important. Yes, you have to manage, mitigate, and do that. What is the important most risk? What is important most risk?
Compliance risk.
Liquidity risk.
Compliance risk. Compliance risk means legal and regulatory risk. Okay. So is that? You are somewhere there.
Liquidity risk.
Okay, liquidity is also important. That is true. So if you have liquidity issues, you might have issues in doing your business. But there are ways and means of, covering them up. You have your, emergency or, the credit lines, then the fallback options, certain treasury backups. All that's there in order to meet, or you can even, if it's medium and long term, you can go in and rather mobilize capital funds, mobilize deposits. You can handle it. I don't say it's not important. It's important, very important. But there's one risk. If you fail
Credit
to
risk.
address, sorry,
Credit
Reputation
risk.
risk.
not clear.
Credit risk.
Reputational risk.
Reputational risk. That's where I'm coming. If your reputation is lost, remember every other thing will be lost on the spot. On the spot. Use that word. Right? How does the banking business operate? How does the banking business operate? What do we sell basically? What do we sell? In a bank or a non-bank, what do we sell?
Services.
Sorry?
Other
Cash.
brand.
We sell, what do we sell? What is the commodity we sell? We have our products and services. True.
Services.
Okay. We have product, we have services. Okay. Through products and services, what do we sell? End of the
Cash.
day, cash. It's
Deposit and
money.
lending.
We sell cash. We sell money. Right? We sell money. You take anything. It's basically we are selling money in different forms. Right? Okay? We are selling money. But in order to sell money, where do you bring money from? To sell. Where do
Depositors.
you? Yes. You have your capital. You have the shareholder funds. Right? But mainly, if you take your balance sheet, what is your largest asset in a balance sheet in a bank or a non-bank? Largest asset in the balance sheet?
Other people's money.
Other people's money is a liability, no?
Loan.
I'm asking about asset in the balance sheet.
Loans and
What is the largest
Loan.
asset
loans
in
and
our balance sheet? Yeah?
Loan.
Loan.
loans and
Your loan
advances.
book. Your loan book is the largest asset in your balance sheet. If you go through your balance sheet now, these days the annual reports are out. Just go through the balance sheet. As compliance, I think you have to have an idea of all. if you are still, you may not be an expert, but it's good if you can have an idea of all the type of business operations taking place in the bank, then you can be a very successful compliance officer, right? So therefore, you need to go through your annual report, try and get an understanding of what's there, right? It's very important to go through your financials, right? So the question I asked was, what is the largest asset in your balance sheet? Or one of the largest assets is basically your loan book. Now I'm asking the next question. What finances the loan book in a big way? Out of your loan book, what is financing the loan book? How do we give loans, basically in layman terms? Initial question was technical. I said, what finances the loan book? In layman terms, in ordinary terms, I'm asking, how do we grant these loans, basically? Using
depositors' funds.
Using the depositors' money, cash, or the money that is brought in by way of deposits to the bank, right? And why people do bring money to you? Obviously, to make a return, to get their interest on the deposit. What is the other important thing that always there in the minds of somebody when they are bringing their money for as a deposit? Safety and sound. Whether they can get their money back when they want. That's running in the back of the mind of any sensible depositor when they make a decision to make a deposit with a bank or a non-bank. Right? It's important to know whether my money is in the safe hands of this bank. Right? So therefore, the reputation of the bank counts a lot. Of course, in Sri Lanka, entire banking industry is highly regulated. Highly regulated. So therefore, chances of a bank collapsing is rather remote under normal circumstances because it's highly regulated, very well supervised, time-tested procedures are there. But in general, it is the customer's reputation or the confidence on the bank or the reputation the bank holds as a sound bank counts a lot. Counts a lot. Right? So therefore, if your reputation is lost, what could be the consequence of that? If your reputation is lost as a sound bank, or whatever it is, your reputation is lost, my God, this bank is having, 101 frauds, internal issues, right? Then very weak credit ratings, high NPAs. What is the picture that's going to be painted in the minds of the investor or the deposit outside the bank? Is it a rosy, good, nice picture or a bad, gloomy picture? Obviously a bad, gloomy picture, right? And I think we all have seen, I think in our lifetime, we have experienced certain banks, even the banks in Sri Lanka, have had this issue of being run over, collapsing, right? So I don't have to name the bank, but there's some issue some time back, couple of decades ago, due to some problem in a group, a particular bank was in trouble. Some of you may be aware, right? And then the people were queuing up to get their deposits back because thinking that that bank will also collapse because that group had issues all around, right? Then was that bank in a position to pay? No, you can't. No bank in the world can pay. All their depositors come in at one time and asking for their money. No bank in the world can pay. That's a known phenomenon. Because we sell that money. So if every depositor comes at the same time and asks for their money, No bank in the world can pay. No bank in the world can pay. So it is the confidence that the customer has on the bank rather prevents them from coming and asking for their money at the same time by all. But it's a very vicious cycle. When the reputation is lost, the word goes around and everybody is very much interested in getting their money back, leaving the interest out, because they know if something happens to the bank, their money is in danger. That we have seen in certain banks or certain customers who have invested their money in certain companies lost their capital as well, because those the banks failed. Those rather most of them were not banks, non-bank failed. Because you can't pay. Even the strongest bank in the world can't pay all their depositors at the same time if they are coming and asking for that money. So it's a known fact. But if your reputation is lost, that's what's going to happen. That is what's going to happen. Right? So therefore, I say the reputation risk is the important most risk. The bankers or the non-bankers always need to keep in their mind, because if that is lost, every other thing will be lost, and probably it can be the funeral of the bank, and the bank can collapse overnight. It can collapse overnight. It won't take years and months to do for that to happen. Right? It can happen immediately. Within a day or two, the bank can collapse, because everybody is wanting money and everybody is rallying around to get the money back. The bank can't pay, and then the panic situation gets further aggravated. And the bank, I mean, at that moment, unless the central bank intervenes and bail them out, you can't pay. That particular incident that I was referring to, central bank took very timely action by changing the board, taking control of the board, and then rather, developing the confidence of the customers. No, nothing to worry, that your money is safe, and that bank survived. And that bank survived. Right? So therefore, the compliance risk was termed as legal and regulatory risk, which can get extended up to losing your reputation and finally ending up with total disaster. Right? So therefore, compliance is very important. There's no need to exaggerate, no need to repeat. So it's important. So sometimes we really don't understand the importance of compliance. The compliance is a very costly function. It's pity that some banks, or at least some officers in certain banks, including the senior, don't understand the importance of compliance, because it's not going to give you a return to your P&L to be seen. The business, okay, will bring your return, bring profit, to the bottom line. Compliance is not going to bring any return there, but remember, compliance will prevent disasters to banks, so that it will not have issues in crashing or being run over. Right? So therefore, it's important that compliance function needs to be very strong. Whilst it's being strong, right, I would say it's a costly, because there are lots of money that you need to pay on for the staff members, maybe to buy systems, maybe to have their various policies, procedures, certain capital buffers. All these are requirements, but still it's necessary, right? So the bank need to avoid compliance risk, right, which can be defined as the risk of legal and regulatory sanction, right, which also could end up with financial and reputational losses. How can this happen? Due to the failure in complying with laws regulations and any other standard and industry best practices. Right. Now, we discussed lots of things. We understood what compliance is. Then we talked about internal, external regulation, requirement that you need to fall in line with it. And we understood or rather learned that it is the prime responsibility lies with the board. So we understood how the board carries out this function by way of policies. Then the policies need to be, there has to be supported. Policies need to be supported with internal rules, regulations, procedures to meet the policy requirement, right? And ultimately, you are meeting the rules and regulations and doing your business in a compliant manner so that you will run your business without any issue, right? So the defining the responsibility for compliance, right, need to clearly allocate and define responsibilities, right? Now, we understood the board is responsible. At the same time, we said every staff member is responsible. It is the very reason that why we need to allocate and define responsibilities. So everybody is responsible, fine. To what extent, for what? That's the question. To what extent, for what? That's the question. So therefore, in order to be very clear on this, right, you need to clearly allocate and define responsibilities in an organization. So every stakeholder has a role to play there, right? So the primary responsibility lies with the board, right? So how do we clearly allocate and define responsibility? How do we do this? How do we do this? So it's what that we need to now learn. Right. Defining responsibility for compliance. Continue. So I'm on slide number 5 now. Accordingly, the board would be required to ensure the following. What is that? Determine the structure of management of the business and the affairs of the bank. Right? Determine the structure of the management of the business and the affairs of the bank. What does this mean? What does this mean? So that is why in the organization, you have the management structure. You have the management structure. There are the corporate management. Below them, probably you may have the senior management, and below them you may have the managers and the line managers and so on and so forth. Right? It has to be very well properly structured to make sure that the business is run in such a way that the responsibility of doing business in a compliant manner also comes hand in hand with the authority given. That's a saying, right? The honor comes with responsibility. Honor comes with responsibility, right? So the benefit that you earn comes along with the responsibility. In other words, let me put it this way. Every function in the bank, there has to be responsibilities and accountabilities placed, very well articulated and placed. Anything. There can't be a kind of a blurred picture. Who is responsible to do what? No. If it's a properly organized bank, properly structured bank, properly job roles defined bank, any function you take, you should be able to clearly identify who is responsible and who is accountable for this. Responsibility comes along with the accountability. And it comes along with the empowering authority also. These are the good practices. You cannot hold somebody accountable if he is not responsible. If one is responsible, he must be given the authority to carry out that work. These are the good practices. right? You cannot hold somebody accountable if he is not responsible for that. You cannot make somebody responsible if he is not empowered to do that. So these things come together. So these are the good practices. It can be the good HR practices, good management practices. So basically what we say is, in defining the responsibility for compliance, we need to understand that the bank needs to determine the structure. When I say bank, it is the board responsibility. Board needs to determine the structure of the management of the business and the affairs of the bank. That is why ultimately you say the compliance, the responsibility lies with the board. So we are now trying to understand how the board member who probably visits the bank once a month or maybe twice a month, right, can be responsible for the entire compliance of the bank. So this is the way, because it's obvious that they cannot go to branches or the departments and then come and interfere into the internal business operations, but they are responsible. How are they carrying that responsibility and how are they going to be made accountable is through this, because they need to make sure that the structure of the management of the business and the affairs of the bank are well defined. Then they need to accept the overall responsibility. Board has to accept the overall responsibility, right? Then once the functions are well defined, they need to delegate the business operations to the KMPs led by the CEO of the company, right? Now you have KMPs, basically the corporate management. KMPs means the key management personnel. Okay? Right, each bank has their KMPs. The people who are sitting in the corporate level, who are basically the senior leader team, the leadership team, KMPs. So the board will delegate those functions through CEO, because the CEO, mostly the CEO, managing director, is a part of the board as well, as the managing director. Right? Some banks have CEO who is not a director, but still through CEO, board will want responsibilities casted on the corporate management, the KMPs, who in turn will take responsibility in implementing the policies of the bank, which have been set and framed by the board members. Correct? Right? So they ensure policy making on business and risk management. Right? So having said that, right, the board needs to ensure the policy making. Policies on what? On business and risk management. Right? So the main objective of the bank is to make profit, increase the value of the shareholders. The growth objectives has to be there. We need to grow. We need to grow our balance sheet. We need to grow our P&L. Right? Growing the balance sheet through which you will grow your P&L. Growth. In simple terms, in layman terms, you need to make profits. If you don't make profits, ultimately, if there's no sustainability, you can't sustain if you're not making profit, right? So, the making policies on business and the risk management is the responsibility of the board, right? And after making policies, the board needs to oversee business and risk management. Board needs to oversee business and risk management. These are the responsibility, defining the compliance responsibility, right? Lot plays or are in the hands of the board. And ensure prudent profit for sustainability, which we mentioned now, which I mentioned now, right? So, how is this done? How is this done? Right? Now you saw the link. Board making policies, and after making the policy on business and the risk management, because risk needs to be managed, and we discussed and understood that the risk is present everywhere in a bank, So you have to manage your risk and you have to manage your business and you have to make your policy. So when the board is entrusted with all these responsibilities and accountability, and it says, okay, there has to be well-defined business delegation, empowering, structures need to be there, and they will convey that through the CEO to the management to carry on the policies of the bank. Right? Now, we very clear on this requirement. How does the board do this? And that's where the compliance will chip in. Compliance department will chip in here. Remember, and I draw your attention to oversee the business and risk management, and the last bullet point, ensure prudent profit for sustainability. The organization need to make profits, right? Now, mostly the compliance. What is the role of compliance? I mean, what is the perception the people have on compliance in your organization? Can somebody answer me? What is the perception of the general perception of the bank on compliance department? Can somebody answer? It can be it need not be in your own bank, right? It can be, but what's the general perception? Can somebody answer, please?
Supporting the business vertical to enhance the profitability.
Okay. What is the perception? That is a requirement. What's the perception? Perception is also the same. You mean the business people, do they always feel that the compliance is supporting the business requirement? Or are they an hindrance to doing business?
As hindrance to doing business.
Sorry? What is the general perception? That they are an hindrance to business. Is that right? Or they always feel, okay, my God, this compliance is very, very supportive. They're always supporting us in the business initiative. What's the general perception? I'm not asking the name of the bank you are representing, or it can be not your bank, some other bank. General perception?
General perception is that compliance is to block things.
He's asking not to do things.
Yeah, not to do, and it's always they are to control things and to block or to
block. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, block. So the general perception is, as you say, that compliance is a hindrance to do business. Because these compliance guys, the general saying, right? They can sit there and say, but we need to go out and get business and do it. No, they don't understand it. Huh? This type of remarks are very common. But what does that tell? Now the board, just go through this. The board responsibility is to ensure that the prudent profit is there for sustainability. Remember the word prudent profit, not just mere profit. You can easily make profits. That's no issue. I mean, if you are a seasoned banker, you know how to make profit. But whether that profit can be sustained, whether it's a sustainable profit, that's the question. Right? I don't have to tell this. If you are really practicing bankers, I mean, you can make profits. And here you said, okay, granting TODs is the highest revenue making product. TODs. If you grant, a couple of large TODs, you will make profit. But are you addressing the risk properly? Is it in line with, or are you doing business in a compliant manner, internal rules, regulations, plus external? Are you keeping your impairments properly in place? Are they being booked? Right? So there are lots of issues. Right? But remember, ensuring prudent profit prudent means wise profits, sustainable profits is the responsibility of the board. And it is so the responsibility of the rest of the staff. And it's the responsibility of the compliance as well. Right? Compliance job is one of the difficult most tasks. But I can say that vouch it with experience. Right? We have seen both sides of the coin. I've been in business, and then I've been in compliance, I've been in risk, I've been in internal audit. So I had that opportunity of seeing all sides of the business or the different angles. And I would rate compliance, if you are doing it properly, it is one of the difficult most functions because you got to balance both sides. You are learning to be a good compliance officer. Right? You need to balance both sides. The compliance has to be complementary and supplementary to do business. That's the word I'm using, complementary and supplementary. It should never be seen as a hindrance. At the same time, remember, you need to follow the rules, regulations, internal, external. Violations can expose you to various risks, including the reputational risk, the financial losses, the sanctions, all kinds of risks. Right? But how to guide them? It's like guiding a ship or sailing a ship or assisting the captain who sails the ship amidst storms, tidal waves, deep sea, rough sea. You're assisting the captain of the ship to do a proper sailing, a safe journey where you would take your ship to the required destination at the required time, estimated time. So therefore, compliance function is that. Right? That's what I say. You have to be supportive to do business. When you understand and go ahead and try to understand the compliance role, I will explain it further. The general belief is, my God, compliance is a horrible set of people, difficult set of people to deal with, but which should not be the case. That's what I said, you need to understand business to some extent, if not fully. If you are an expert, so much the better. But you need to have some, at least a minimum understanding of that particular business operation. Starting from cash, starting from opening of accounts, starting from KYC, that's your own, definitely directly on your plate, right? FDs, savings, mobilizing savings, credit, recoveries, treasury operations, anything and everything in the bank. You need to have a fair idea of what that transaction is, right? Therefore, I would term a compliance officer as a consultant physician as against consultant specialists on different fields, right? Take that gives lots of meaning and understanding to the points that I'm going to trace here. You need to be a consultant physician. Who is a consultant physician? Physician is a general doctor, maybe a family doctor, just an MBBS guy. He treats you for everything, starting from cough, cold, fever, even a small, might have some wound. They still treat you, right? But if it's a serious heart problem, heart surgery, whom will you go to? Consultant, heart specialist. If it's a serious allergy or some skin disease, either you would go to a specialized dermatologist. skin specialist or an immunologist. If it is something to do with your lungs, you might go and see a surgeon specialized on it. If it is something to do with some, the VOG matter, you'll go to a VOG, right? If it is something to do with some serious problem with the children, you'll go to a pediatrician. There are specialized doctors who are specialized on brain specialists, neuro specialists. He specialized on that. But you have general consultant physicians who has specialization on every area, but probably not up to the extent of a consultant. Now you have your normal doctor, MBBS doctor, and then you have consultant physician. Right? If you have some nerve issue, consultant physician can treat you. But if it's a very serious one or you need further attention, you will go to a consultant neurologist or a neurosurgeon. Right? But when you go to the consultant neurosurgeon, he will definitely not treat you for some heart issue. He will not go and treat you for some fever. You will not go there. But if you have some chronic fever, you might go to a consultant physician who has a knowledge of all this, specialist knowledge in all these areas. Probably maybe a little lower to that particular area specialist has. So I would term a compliance officer, a successful compliance officer, you need to be a consultant physician, not a normal doctor, medical officer, but a consultant physician. I think it gives you a kind of a flavor of as to what the compliance role is all about. That's what I say. You need to learn and try to understand the business. But if you have this knowledge, then it's very easy to buy them in. It's very easy to buy them in. It's very easy to make the compliance function supplementary and complementary, rather than making the people in the business line to feel that the compliance is a menace. My God, for everything they are saying no, not to do it, not to do it. Right? It's not the case. Okay? Have you understood that?
Yes, sir.
Any answers? Yes. Okay, thank you. So you understand the compliance role now to some extent, right? So if you have this knowledge, you can always assist them to do it the right way, show them the right way to do it, guide them the proper way to do business. For an example, right? You say, if you don't have your KYC, you can't open an account. What is KYC? What is KYC? What's KYC? So it's definitely on your plate. You would have learned through Mr. Rupa Singh also. What is KYC? Know your customer. So after that, can I ask you the question, are there any customers whom you do not know? Whom you do not know? No, you know them. But know your customer concept means you must know your customer to the extent where you understand where does he come from, what does he do, what are his sources of income, right? What are the income levels, and what type of business in which he is or she is engaged in, how much of money he's going to route through your bank, right? So this type of, comprehensive set of information needs to be there with you if you want to go ahead and deal business with that part. Okay? But suppose you get a very good customer. Look at it from the, the business angle, a super customer. When this world is the market economy, it's demand and supply. Equilibrium is on the demand and supply. The good things are highly demanded, right? It's not so good things are not so demanded. And if you are a super customer and everybody is trying to grab that customer into your organization, in general, the customer will be highly demanding. Is that right or not? Is that right or not? At least the people in the front line, the private banking, there was one, right? Are the private banking customers highly demanding or not? They are demanding.
Yes, I think so.
They are demanding, right? So when they demand, that's why you have those, the banks have identified and then set up those units to treat the private banking customers because they are so good. I mean, the demanding, and the operations with them are very much beneficial to the bank. That's why we give them special treatment. Sometimes you take the documents to their doorstep, right? You treat them, outside the queue and the line, and have an enclosed area to treat them, right? Because they are demanding, right? Sometimes getting documents from these customers is a difficult thing, right? So you got to look at this in such a way that creates an environment to not to lose such business. With the compliance support that is needed there, right? So especially not only account opening, just take the corporate customer, those who are doing credit, right? I can't remember whether there are people here in this program who are doing credit, but we have done credit. We know when you are dealing with the corporate clients, very difficult to get information from you, right? Sometimes you go and ask A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H from an ordinary customer. But you go to a corporate client, they say, no, I mean, our accounts are published, you take from there. We give you the management accounts, right? So you got to do better research. Of course, information is there on the public domain as well, if it's such a big, large corporate client. But they are demanding, right? Just because they are demanding, or they may say, okay, no, I don't have the NIC copy. Are we going to lose a customer like that? NIC copy is a must, but then you will support and then tell them how to get that, right? I'm just talking about the practical scenario. You got to be practical when you are doing compliance in a practical sense. Otherwise, very easy to say no. Corporate client, right? Okay, very top end executive in the country, right? CEO or a managing director of a blue chip conglomerate wants to open a private banking account, right? You have to have the NIC copy, this and that and this. You think he will bring all these documents and walk into your bank to open that account? Will he do that? Very seldom. Will he do that? Yes or no? Yes or no?
No.
Yes. Most probably no. Are we going to lose that business? Are we going to lose that business?
No, sir.
You can't say, I mean, say in practical scenario, right? Okay, the top end, I don't want to name, very famous business. Top end, owner of a series of big, large conglomerate. You're trying to canvass him, right? So the NIC copy is not there. Are we going to say no to him? I'm asking a very practical question. As per theory, if NIC copy is not there, you cannot open. So the customer is so busy, right? So he probably may not have the NIC copy when the account is to be open and you have a very good business opportunity to open it, right? What is your way of doing it?
We can
What is
reach
your-
him for that document.
Huh?
We can go there. We can go there and collect the documents.
Yeah, there are ways and means of doing it.
Yes.
But the fact remains is the NIC copy is not there, but you are going to probably open the account, right? So this is where the balancing act comes into play. I'm not asking you to deviate, right? We have to get it. Probably you may have to talk to the personal assistant and get it, right? You will open the account, but the NIC copy may not be there. But if you go to the public domain, you know who he is. Whole heap of information is there about the customer. If you want, you can still take a crib and see if you want. So needed, there are various other tools that you can use, right? Okay. So how do we deal in that type of situation? The compliance need to guide. That's what I say, the compliance role is extremely difficult task. You can easily say no to everything. But at the end of the day, that will affect business, right? Then only that negative feeling develops in the minds of the business crowd or the frontliners. My God, you cannot do anything with our compliance. They're going to say no to everything, right? So you need to understand the risk without the NIC. Why is the NIC needed? To understand who this person is. If you are very sure that it is so and so, okay, we know that risk is somewhat mitigated. But it doesn't mean that you cannot open you can open the account without taking the NIC forever. No. There's no reason for him not to give the NIC also. But you got to get it in such a way that, okay, you can probably talk to the personal assistant, send somebody and get the documents signed, all that. I just took one little example. Is that. So the compliance role is that. So you have to be supportive to do business whilst making sure that you are fully compliant, right? So how you do this? It's a gilt edge function, right? You're on the blade of a sword, but that's your role. You have to play it accordingly. Otherwise, the people will reject you. You will not be a successful compliance officer. You will not be a successful compliance professional, right? Doesn't mean that you can breach the requirements. No. Right? Now we're on slide number 5, I think. Right? Then we'll see what's there on the slide number 6. That's what I say. There are lots of things we are discussing which you don't find in the note itself. You have to make these comments. Well, note these comments in your notebook or wherever you have, because it will be necessary for you to, when you are framing your answers, like this is not a O-level examination where you will have a direct question to say, name, just what you need to take to open an account. No, that type of questions you will not get. You will get a question to discuss the scenarios, taking the stuff from the material, and this type of discussions that we are having will help you to give a very rich answer depending on the question that's being formed. Did you all understand that? Right. I think you all have a practice of taking a break in between, correct? Do you have that practice previously?
Yes, sir.
You do take a break in between, no?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So is it a good time to take a break, or you want to continue for some more time and then take a break? Yeah? You want to continue or to take a break now? We're just about done about 2 hours, no? Okay. What's your requirement? I can deliver. I have no issue. I can even go ahead without a break. What's your requirement? Is IBSL representative on here? Kavi or Menaka? How have you done it in the previous session?
Previous sessions are that 10:30, around 10:30, the lecturer giving us a half an hour interval there. So we'll start and resuming at 11.
Right. So we will take a break now and come again around 11 o'clock. Now it's about 10:35, right? So 25 minutes enough for you?
Okay.
Right. So we will reassemble around 11 o'clock to continue, right? And in the meantime, if you have your friends who have not logged in, please do invite them and tell them to take it. Have you all seen the amount of discussion that we go through outside the slide? Right? So these are important things for you to note down, especially to develop your knowledge and also to answer the question. Right. So thank you very much. We'll meet up around 11 o'clock. Right. Now, I think we didn't discuss slide number 6, no? Okay. Now we are continuing the defining the responsibility for compliance. The compliance department is responsible for identification of compliance risk, implementation of controls, and monitoring of those controls. Right? So in doing so, the compliance would involve themselves in the following key stages. Now, what does the first bullet say? Compliance department is responsible for identification of compliance risk, implementation of controls, and monitoring of those controls. So what is compliance risk then? We discussed. Now you need to answer. What is compliance risk? What is compliance risk? Risk of legal and regulatory sanctions, right? So that is compliance risk. The compliance department is responsible for identification of compliance risk, implementation of controls, and monitoring of those controls. Now, very important, remember. Now, compliance risk is risk of legal and regulatory sanctions. Okay. Risk of legal, right? Regulatory sanctions, okay, it's very clear. There are sanctions, especially comes under the AML CFT regime. So that's a different party. But when you say the defined as risk of legal and regulatory sanctions, so risk of legal means the entire other business operations which are governed by various laws, regulations, do come into play here, right? Now, this word legal opens it out to a very wide spectrum where it could be how you are dealing with the bill of exchange ordinance, how you are dealing with the certain treasury functions, how you are dealing with the banking act, how you are dealing with the companies act, how you are dealing with the partnership act. There are lots of laws that governs the industry of banking, which has come by way of various regulations, directions, etc. And the international best practices and the time-tested banking practices. So the compliance risk means it covers everything. Regulatory sanction part is very clear. You would have learned. We have various sanction lists, UN sanction list, OFAC sanction list, right? Then the EU sanction list, the French sanction list, right? There can be so many sanction lists, right? So that part is very clear on the face of it. But when you say the legal risk, right, it covers a full gamut of the entire business operations, right? Any business function that falls within the gamut of banking or the non-banking would involve legal risk if you do not do it properly. So the compliance risk covers basically entire the business operations of the bank or the company, right? So it's basically the compliance department responsible to identify the compliance risk, which is legal and regulatory sanction. Legal, I explained to you, and gets extended up to the entire business operations of the bank or the company. So the compliance is responsible to check all this. Then implementation of controls and monitoring of such controls, right? So I will explain this when you are doing about the governance in our next module, right? How compliance will work hand in hand with the risk department, risk function, and the audit function, and the business functions, right? Which are complementary and supplementary to do the compliance risk monitoring, identification, and measurement and mitigation, right? So remember, it will be the responsibility of the compliance department to identify the compliance risk, implementation of controls, and monitoring of those controls. Now you would wonder how you are going to bring controls, but I will explain it. If you are not clear, end of the day, you need to ask me and clarify your points. In short, please remember, compliance will be responsible to ensure that the entire business operation of the bank is done in a compliant manner, keeping in line with the external, internal regulations. External regulations, I'm just taking your memory back. The laws imposed by the legislature, plus the directions, guidelines, circulars issued by the regulator. Internal are ones that are stemming from those. So the compliance need to ensure that the business is run in that manner. So in doing so, the compliance would involve themselves in the following key stages, right? So these are basically the stages that the compliance would involve themselves in carrying out their, delivering their responsibilities. One is the identification of risk, right? Then quantifying and evaluating the risk, implementing controls, monitoring and assurance, escalation, reporting, resolution, and regular reviews. What does each point mean? Right? In risk management, probably you would have done with some other resource personnel. Identification of risk. First, you need to identify as to what this risk is all about. You need to identify the risk, right? And which are done through various risk techniques, right? If I tell you, the RCS says risk control self-assessment, which is a specialist risk function, right? But better for you also to know that there are things like that, tools and the techniques, right? So based on the information from those risk department, internal audit department, and the central bank regulatory examination reports, and through various compliance checks that you are going to do, which we will do in the latter part of this session, how you are going to do those. Compliance will have to, for the time being, understand and keep it in mind that you need to identify the risk. Then once you, anything, whether it's compliance or anything, once a risk is identified, you need to quantify the risk. Quantify the risk. Take it in certain money terms. Quantify it to see how much that could impact us if this risk is not duly mitigated or controlled or avoided. Quantifying and evaluating. You are taking a measurement of the risk. How big or how small or how severe or how trivial, you know, that this risk is in terms of, you know, financial value. Then implementing controls. Once a risk is identified and you measure the magnitude of the risk, then you need to implement the controls. How? Because I told you, There's nothing that you can do without taking any risk in the industry of banking and finance. It is so unique to banking, it's applicable to the non-banks as well. Everything you do, there's a risk. So you identify the risk, then you measure the risk, quantify the risk, and then you need to implement the controls. What controls need to be in place to mitigate this risk? Right. The money laundering risk you take for an example, right? The money laundering risk you would have learned through another resource person in this program itself is the risk of the money launderers or the fraudsters or the gangsters misusing your system in order to hide the true origin of illegally made money. That's the money laundering. Money laundering is that your system is being misused, or they misuse your system to hide the true origin of illegally or blood-tainted money. So, what are the controls that you can bring in to mitigate this risk? So, this is the compliance function, right? While saying this, I want you to make it, to understand it very clearly. There are certain functions and the risks that come straight on your plate, and there are certain risks and the functions which do not come straight on your plate because there will be a separate risk owner or a process owner for that. If you take money laundering, it comes directly on the plate of the risk department, compliance department, because it's your bread and butter. But another risk like credit risk, it doesn't come directly on the plate on the compliance department. That's another risk owner or a process owner for credit. It could be the credit department, it could be the risk department. It could be credit administration, or it could be any other related department like that. You take the cyber risk, it doesn't directly comes on lies on the plate on the compliance department. The IT is there, risk IT function is there, cyber security functions are there. So it will come through them. But remember, compliance needs to make sure and identify through them such risk. Your compliance is not going to do and make evaluation of the IT risk. Risk may do it, but you need to get input from these departments, your counter departments. Through governance, I will take you through and give you a feedback how these different functions are integrated and making sure that you do your business in a compliant manner. That we will learn later. But for the time being, so it is the risk compliance function to identify the risk. Certain risks are directly under your purview. Certain risks may not be directly coming under your purview. It may be through another person. Whatever it is, compliance needs to identify them. And implement control. The implementing controls also you may do. If it is directly coming under your purview, you may implement the controls. If it is an area which does not come directly under you, you may make sure that such owner, such process owner introduces the controls to mitigate that particular risk which comes under their purview, right? Then thereafter, monitoring and assurance. Once the risk is there, mitigation activities are there, you need to continuously monitor and have assurance that these risks are duly mitigated and controlled. Once this is done, you need to escalate the identified risk and the various other related information to higher levels. When you say higher levels, it could be within the organization, maybe to the Executive Risk Management Committee, maybe to the Board Integrated Risk Management Committee, or it could be certain things that you may have to escalate to the outside parties like the FIU, right? If there's a money laundering risk and then you have identified a suspicious transaction or a suspicious scenario taking place within the organization, you need to escalate it to the FIU as the compliance officer. So escalation also falls under different platforms. Certain escalations are within the organization. Certain escalations do go beyond the organization. Some go through the internal layers. Some don't go through the internal layers. Example, STR. It doesn't go through the internal layer. It goes straight to the FIU. Right. So, lastly, you need to ensure that there's resolution of the identified issue or the problem. And thereafter, you got to have regular reviews in order to prevent recurrence, repetition. You got to have regular reviews on the system, on the process, either by yourself. When I say you, I'm referring to compliance, or through your other counterparts who are responsible in those areas. Right? So, are we clear on it? In compliance, it's responsible for identification of compliance, implementing controls and monitoring the control. In doing that, these are the steps that the compliance need to follow. Right? Is it clear? Right. So we'll move on to the next slide. I'm on slide number 7 now. Defining the responsible compliance. Thereafter, each business line is responsible to carry out their businesses in accordance with the bank's compliance policy and the system. Right? So this is exactly which I mentioned to you now. So each business unit, the business unit, when I say business unit, don't get the feeling that we are talking about the frontline business unit, right? What we are meaning here is the process. It could be a frontline business or any other internal process. The business or the process owner is responsible to carry out their businesses in accordance with the bank's compliance policy. Right? You take the finance department, owner is the CFO. So CFO is responsible to prepare the accounts, keeping in line with the regulatory requirements. That is the requirements spelled out by the Institute of Chartered Accountants. Sri Lanka fall in line with the accounting standards and the international IFRS financial reporting standards, and make the disclosures, preparation of accounts and all that. So he is responsible to do that. But can the compliance keep the hands crossed and wait outside? No. Compliance need to make sure that the finance department carries out its duties in accordance with the bank's policies. In accordance with the bank's policies. Whether there are sufficient procedures, effective, robust procedures within the organization in order to drive the policy requirements. That's the compliance function, right? So you need to go through the various policies and the procedural documents. You can have a policy, board can approve it, so it becomes the policy of the bank, becomes the policy of the company. But unless and otherwise, there are effective procedures specified and laid down and put into practice in order to meet the policy requirements, nothing will happen despite the policy being there and approved by the board. Right? So the compliance job is to make sure through your compliance checks to see whether when a policy is framed or when a new regulation is imposed by the regulator or when a new law is passed by the parliament, to see whether the relevant process owner prepares and put in place or put into practice adequate procedures to meet those policy requirements. Right? So that's what the bullet one says. Thereafter, each business line is responsible to carry out their businesses in accordance with the bank's compliance policy and system. Beyond that, right? When you say the bank compliance policy, don't take it wrong. It's not confined only to the bank's compliance policy, right? You can, if you want, you can make an amendment. The bank policies, right? All policies are basically meant to do things in a compliant manner, right? So beyond that, each employee would individually be responsible for complying with the control rules and regulations, right? So you have the policy, then you have the procedures. So each employee is responsible to carry out the provisions of the procedure. Internally laid down rules and regulations. Each employee is responsible. Again, go back to what I mentioned. There has to be everything, for anything, responsibilities and accountabilities casted. Right? There shouldn't be any loose end in anything. It can come by way of line of authority. It can come by way of your various JDs that have been issued to you. Right? But now say a cashier. Cashier is responsible to take cash, count it properly, and lodge cash and issue receipts and all that and all, so on and so forth. Right? So once he or she is appointed as a cashier, there's a responsibility casted on that person. Then there's a responsibility casted on the supervisor of that person to ensure that they guide the cashier to business in the proper way. For example, to check for the counterfeit notes, the training is given to make sure that the customers are declaring the purposes. If it's a third-party deposit, I'm just giving a few examples. When there's a third-party deposit made, if it's about 200,000, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm telling about the figure that when I was in the bank, unless it's revised now. So anything above 200,000, third party making a deposit to somebody's account, you need to record certain key information, name of the depositor, purpose of the remittance or the deposit, then the reason for the deposit, then the name and address of the depositor. All that information needs to be recorded. So it's a internal outside requirement, FIU guideline, or FIU minimum rules and regulations issued. Based on it, you probably may have issued your internal regulation. So it needs to be, then the responsibility is casted on the cashier to get that information. Similarly, the responsibility will be casted on the supervising officer to ensure that that is properly done. Then finally, the branch manager will be responsible to make sure that the supervising officer carries out the duties accordingly, and the cashier takes the due information when a transaction is done. This is how the responsibility works, right? Now, where does the board get found fault? If these policies are not there, if the procedures are not there, and if there's any issue identified and highlighted by the regulator that the relevant regulation has not been duly followed by the bank, then the investigation starts in to see whether why that happened. Is it due to lack of procedures, lack of policies, or whether the policies and the procedures were there, it was not done by the parties concerned. Could be due to willful act, due to ignorance, due to negligence. It could happen due to many, many reasons. So it needs to be identified. Remember, I said the board will be responsible to meet the regulatory requirement. Now, this particular example, regulatory requirement is to record the information, right? So the board has to make sure the policy is there, the procedures are there, and the responsibilities have been casted. Then the board responsibility, they have done their part. Because you can't expect the board to come and watch the cashier in the branch to see whether he is being recorded or not. This is how the procedure and the responsibilities and the accountabilities get casted upon each and every person, and it flows down the line. right, in order to meet the final policy requirement. Right. The compliance needs to make sure in this case, see whether was the policy there, has that been approved, has that been duly reviewed at least on an annual basis, whether the procedures are there, whether the procedures are being done. Right. So the compliance will get input from the audit report, the risk report, so on and so forth, and compliance. Technically compliance needs to do carry on their compliance checks also within the compliance program. So they will identify, and then the relevant action can be taken. So beyond that, each employee would be responsible. So finally, in order to ensure that the above defined responsibilities are duly taken care of, board would rely on the compliance officer. This is exactly what I was telling all this time. Right? Why the responsibility is casted on the compliance department and on the compliance officer. Board would rely on the compliance officer because the compliance officer is the conduit between the management or the bank and the board of directors as far as these matters are concerned. Right? The board would delegate the responsibility down the line through KMPs, through the CEO. But whether things are being done in the compliant manner, the board of directors would heavily dependent or rely on the compliance officer to support them by checking and attending to all these controls and the risk mitigating measures that we are discussing now, and and informing them should there be any reason for that merits their attention. Is it clear? Is it clear to you all?
Yes.
Right. Now you need to make your comments accordingly in your notes or whatever it is, how these processes do work. Because the handout given or the slides that I have shared will not comprehensively explain this connectivity, right? So that you need to know, A, to do your compliance function in an effective manner when you get back to your workstation, B, to pass your examinations by providing a comprehensive answer if a question is raised on these areas. Right. The requirement to appoint. Now we saw the link now. Board responsible, AMPs, then it comes down, then the compliance has certain functions to do, then the board relies on compliance officer to help them or to support them in doing this. Now, in order to do that, the law requires the bank to appoint a compliance officer. The requirement to appoint a compliance officer, which is a legal requirement. The financial institutions are required to appoint a compliance officer who shall be responsible for ensuring the FI, financial institutions, compliance through the following requirements. So these are the requirements which has necessitated the bank to appoint compliance officers. Bank supervision direction dated 14/9/1998 regarding the appointment of compliance officers. The bank supervision has issued a direction. I explained to you the meaning. Direction, guideline, circular has different weights. Direction is a kind of a direct, strict order you have to do. So 14/9/98, Bank Supervision issued a direction to appoint a compliance officer. In addition to that, FTRA, Financial Transaction Reporting Act number 6 of 2006, section 14, very clearly states with regard to the appointment of a compliance officer, and it has even given, the functions that need to be done by the compliance officer, mainly focusing on the MLC-FT regime, right? So the compliance officer appointment comes through two documents now, bank supervision document plus the FTRA, which is the law. It's not a direction, it is the law passed by the parliament, requires the banks and the FIs to appoint a compliance officer, and the functions to be dealt by such compliance officer is detailed in the FTRA section 14. In addition, the Exchange Control Department circular letter dated 17 June 2013 also insists the appointment of compliance officers. Right now, you see the appointment of compliance officer is a regular requirement which comes through three sources which we identified. One is the law, FTRA, one is through the BSD circular, and one is through an exchange control circular. Right. So we identified now, we know the mechanism, we are now getting into the chemistry of this, how this is happening, mechanism. Now we identified why a compliance officer is appointed and why and how compliance officers are appointed. So once the compliance officer is appointed, it is important to define a job description or a contract for the compliance officer. Basically, the responsibilities that's entrusted to the compliance officer in the bank, right? We are going to go through and identify what are the areas that need to go into the job description of the compliance officer. So on the other hand, it becomes the functions of the compliance officer, right? Our topic today is creating a compliance culture and the role of the compliance officer. Now we are getting little by little entering into the topic now. Okay. So the CEO means the compliance officer's JD should be tailored to the specific needs of the entity and the jurisdiction concerned, right? So the compliance officer JD will depend on or it will be customized to meet the specific needs of that particular entity and also the jurisdiction in which that entity is placed. Okay. So if the compliance officer is appointed for a bank in Sri Lanka, they got to take the requirement of that particular jurisdiction, that is the Sri Lankan requirements will be taken into account when you are defining the responsibilities of the compliance officer for this country. And also it will depend on the entity for which that the compliance officer is appointed. Bank or non-bank, or it can be some other company, whatever it is. So those are the things that you will take into consideration when designing the JD. So factors to be considered should include this plus many things. Job title and grade is very obvious. Employer, who the employee is, the type of business, whether it's a financial industry or some manufacturing industry, whatever it is, right? And then reporting lines, very important. The reporting lines of the compliance officer. The purpose of the job purpose, main duties and accountabilities, right? The reporting lines extremely important in the banking sector and even in the non-banking financial institutions. Compliance officers' functional reporting has to be directly to the board subcommittee. We say in simple terms, we say the compliance officer report directly to the board and not to the CEO or to any other officer, right? Functional responsibility. There can be dotted line responsibilities or reporting lines maybe to CEO, COO, whoever it is. That is basically on the administrative matters like taking leave, granting leave, that type of things. There can be a dotted line reporting, but functionally, the compliance officer in Sri Lanka, banks as well as non-banks, NBFIs, need to report to the chair of the board integrated subcommittee, risk management subcommittee. Now, under governance, we will learn about the board committees, the subcommittees, and all that. For the time being, those who are in compliance and in banks, there is a regulatory subcommittee of the board, which is known as Board Integrated Risk Management Committee, which is headed by an independent non-executive director as the chair of that committee, right? So the compliance officer reporting line goes to the BRMC chair, And the risk officer's reporting is also, in general, not to the CEO of the company, but to the chair of the BIRMC and the chief internal auditor. Internal auditor's reporting line goes to the board audit committee. Board audit committee. So the reporting line is very important. So that is why the reporting line is marked like that, is in order to make the compliance function independent, which is a requirement, right? Because the board is relying on the compliance officer towards meeting all the regulatory requirements, and the compliance officer serves as a conduit between the board and the management and the bank. And the reporting line is after independent reporting line to the risk committee is to ensure that the independence required by the compliance officer is given to him or her to do the reporting without any bias and in a fearless manner. So the actual situation will be brought to the notice of the board of directors. Main duties and accountability. What are the main duties and the accountabilities, which is common in any JD, right? So similarly, all the duties and responsibilities will be casted in the job description of the compliance officer. Then also it will say the required knowledge, expertise, and the qualifications required for one to be appointed as a compliance officer will also go into that JD. What qualifications are required, what expertise is required, and what knowledge levels are required for this person to function in an effective manner as the compliance officer. And also it will spell out the skills and the competencies required by the compliance officer, so that you will know that the person appointed as the compliance officer is a skillful, competent person who can deliver that job to meet the expectation of the board and the various other regulatory requirements, right? And then also it will say what are the registrations, approval, licenses, if applicable, in the JD with regard to the compliance officer role, right? Now, is this clear? Now, these points, just rather than just remembering them by heart, the important most thing is why these are said in the textbook, because you need to translate the purposes behind these things into the practical situation and see how important these requirements, which you find in the theory and the textbook, in doing this business in a practical way in order to meet the desired expectations of the board and the regulators, and then so on and so forth. Right? Is it clear? Right. So we are now moving on to the next slide. The board must appoint the compliance officer to be responsible for the robust compliance function. So the board appoints him. It is appointed by it has to be sanctioned by the board, compliance officer appointment. Right? The board has different subcommittees, regulatory level subcommittees. What are the subcommittees? Can somebody tell me? Regularly specified subcommittees of the board of directors. Can somebody unmute the mic and tell me? Please, one by one.
Risk Management Committee. Risk Management Committee.
Okay.
Remuneration Committee.
Sorry?
Remuneration Committee.
Yeah, HRRC, Human Resources and Remuneration
ALCO.
Committee. Yeah. ALCO is the internal committee. It's not a board subcommittee.
Audit Committee.
Audit Committee.
Audit Committee, Board Audit Committee, BAC, yes. Then?
Internal Risk Management Committee.
That's again not a board subcommittee, that's the internal committee like ALCO. There's one more important thing. Nominations Committee, right? So, Board Audit Committee, Board Integrated Risk Management Committee, then the HRRC, Human Resource and Remuneration Committee, then you have the Nomination Committee, and then you have so many other, and RPT, Related Party Subcommittee, that's also a newly formed one, RPT, and though it's not regulatory mandatory, many boards have the board strategy committee, very important one, right? And you can have different committees like that. But certain other committees that you all mentioned, internal risk committee, or you call it the executive risk management committee, is an internal committee. ALCO, Assess Liability Management Committee, is an internal committee, right? That's within the organization, not at the board level, right? So the board has various committees like that, and reporting lines we discussed. Audit committee, chief internal auditor report direct to the audit committee. Then the compliance officer and the CO, chief compliance officer, and the chief risk officer, CRO, report directly to the board risk management committee chair. So that means you are reporting to the board. So this board must appoint the compliance officer, and likewise the appointment of them also is done by the board, because it has to definitely, of course, the management recommends, and the board has to sanction. Management can't appoint any compliance officer or the risk officer or the audit officer without being sanctioned by the board. Any other appointments they may do other than the KMPs, mostly sometimes the KMP appointments also board involves HRRC and the nomination committee, right? But there's no regulatory barrier for them not to appoint without referring to board. But these committees, the regulations specifically say it has to be appointed by the board, right? So the board appoints them. Then the CEO should advise and assist the board in complying with the bank's obligations under the regulatory system, right? The compliance officer needs to advise and assist the board, because that's the conduit between the bank and the board. So the compliance officer will have to keep on advising and assisting the board with regard to complying or carrying out the business operations, whether they are complying with the bank's obligations under various regulatory systems, whether they are meeting the regulatory requirements. The board of directors and the senior management should demonstrate their commitment to high standards of compliance and ethics. Now remember, at the start I said the compliance is a top-down approach. At the same time, I said the board has to demonstrate the tone from the top. And at the same time, I said if they fail to do this, talking about good compliance is just a nightmare. You cannot do it unless you have the blessing from the top. So here in the textbook, it says the board of directors and senior management should demonstrate their commitment. They need to be committed to high standard of compliance and ethics within the organization. Because these are public listed companies mostly, even otherwise, though it may not be public listed, but those are systemically important organizations in the financial environment of the country. So they have to demonstrate their commitment and high standards of compliance and ethics. The compliance function should support the management in building a robust compliance culture based on ethical standards of behavior which contribute to effective corporate governance. Right. Now, this is the role of compliance. All this we are talking about. Right. The compliance function should support the management. In doing what? In building a robust compliance culture within the organization. You have to have a compliance culture within the organization. Right? So without a compliance culture being created within the organization, you cannot make sure that the organization runs its operations in a compliant manner. You cannot do that. So it is the responsibility of the compliance to create that robust compliance culture, right? Based on how is it created? Based on ethical standards of behavior. So all have to behave in an ethical manner, right? When governance, we are learning governance, I'll tell you what ethics are, right? For the time being, remember, ethical behavior which contributes to effective corporate governance. And corporate governance is another important word which we will learn in detail when you are doing the governance under the next module, right? Corporate governance is good governance, right? Highly misused word in the recent past, yaha palane. That's good governance, which is truly speaking stemming from the ancient time, from the king's time, ancient time, Dasaraja Dharma is somewhat similar, right? Good governance. Whether you have a transparent good governance system within the organization, right? So the compliance culture can be created only if you are behaving on the ethical standards and which would ultimately contribute towards the effective corporate governance within the organization, right? Any questions up to this point? Have you understood? Can I have an answer, please?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, this is the problem in this, the e-environment, electronic platform. But you are in a class, I see your facial expressions, right? You see me, I see you all. It's quite different. So anyway, we have to manage. So these are the evolving changes and the challenges faced by the bank. Even our meetings are now conducted through on an e-platform. But sometimes it's more effective also, right? But there are pluses and minuses, pros and cons, like that, especially for training and all. Whilst it creates or rather gives you so many advantages, it has certain disadvantages, like the limitations you have in interacting with the audience to with whom you are talking and then interacting. Anyway, never mind. So we need to move on. So having said that, I said the compliance is a top-down approach, and the board has to set the tone from the top. The same thing is being said in different language here. Compliance starts at the top. You cannot think of doing compliance or creating a compliance culture if the top is ignorant and top faces can't respect to doing business in a compliant manner. So therefore, the compliance starts at the top. When you say top, from board, MD/CEO, corporate manager, the KMPs, and compliance officer, and goes down the line. Compliance starts at the top. Effectiveness of compliance would heavily depend on the corporate culture, right? Effectiveness of that would depend on the corporate culture. If your corporate culture is supportive towards the compliant, doing business in a compliant manner, of course it will succeed. But if your corporate culture is something that does not support it or does not recognize, then of course creating the effectiveness of the compliance culture would suffer. Right? You understand? The BOD and the senior management should lead by example. This is very important. They should lead by example. Right? They can't tell different stories and act differently. There's a saying to say, walk the talk. Right? You need to lead by example, show that you really mean it. Right? You can't tell the downstairs or the juniors, I mean, do your business in a compliant manner while the top is doing totally unethical things and not doing things in a compliant manner. Then it doesn't work. Then the culture is not there. In a good compliance culture, everybody will be doing things right way, in an ethical manner. in a transparent manner. Giving the due focus on the regulation, the requirement, the risk management, right? All that is there. So therefore, compliance starts at the top. Effectiveness of compliance would heavily depend on the corporate culture. BOD and the senior management should lead by example. CEO should ensure that the bank has appropriate systems of internal control to adequately measure and manage the risk it encounters to avoid regulatory repercussions. I think we discussed this before that also. The CEO means the compliance officer, should ensure that the bank has appropriate systems of internal control. Right? Now the policy is there, the procedures needs to be there. With the procedures, you need to bring the internal controls into place. Right? Any of these things lacking, that means we are heading for disaster. We are going to have problems. Right? So the appropriate systems of internal controls should be there, and the CEO should ensure that those are there. If not there, he will have to liaise with the party concerned, the process owner concerned, and bring and implement those internal controls, which is a requirement to do business in a compliant manner. Right? Internal control adequately measure and manage the risk. Now, that was the way discussed. Once you identify a risk, you need to quantify. You need to measure the risk. Right? It encounters to avoid the regulatory repercussions. So once it is identified that there are problems in the controls or weaknesses in the control or controls are lacking or deficiencies in the control, you need to identify the magnitude of the issue. Right? And then manage it. When you say manage it, if there's a gap, you need to fill the gap. Right? If there's certain improvement needed, you need to bring those improvements and then bridge the gap. If there's a total void, again, you need to introduce and get those things done. To do what? To avoid regulatory repercussions. If you don't do that, there will be regulatory repercussions. There will be regulatory repercussions if you fail to do that. Right? So who is responsible to do all this and to coordinate and then bring this compliance culture within the organization? The driving force is the compliance officer. The driving force is the compliance officer. Right? Then the last bullet, to provide guidance on proper application and interpretation of laws. Right? Regulations and the policies applicable to the institute. Now, this is a very important, very important function of the compliance, the role of the compliance. When a new regulation is issued or when a new law is introduced, right, you got to give or provide guidance as regards to the proper application and interpretation of the law as the regulation. Now, the compliance, my colleagues in the compliance would certainly know that when certain circulars are issued by the regulator, sometimes it's very complex, not easy to understand, especially when you don't know the subject. Especially, I just take your focus on the exchange control based regulation. Sometimes very complex. If you don't know, you may not be able to interpret it. So you need to give that guidance, support, and interpret it properly for the business and the down the line people to understand that requirement. I know there are some, it's not the best way to do. They just forward the central bank regulations to the business. One simple reason is the compliance, they themselves can't interpret it properly, and they just pass it down to cover themselves. Pass it down is perfect, okay, but you need to give the relevant proper guidance and tell them what exactly this circular refers to, what exactly you should do and what exactly you should not do, what procedures you need to amend. Enabling the business to understand it better, provide further clarity so that it will be very, effectively implemented. Right? So, provide guidance and proper application and the interpretation of law. Interpretation is one thing, application of how does that apply within the organization? What are the impacts? What are the counter issues that can arise doing that? Right? And what changes are needed in the policy in order to do that? All that, the compliance has the major responsibility to inform or advise the business or the process owners down the line. Sometimes you may work closely or in liaison with the process owner concerned and help them, and through a synergetic approach, bring out the essence of the circular or the new direction or the new requirement and pass it down to the process, the frontliners or the operational people so that they could follow them properly. In order to do certain things, sometimes you may require system support. Then you need to bring it to the notice of the parties concerned and probably get the system support on it. Sometimes you may have to procure a new system or some arm in order to get it done. So compliance need to take charge of that situation and give their best to support business. That's what I say compliance role is just a very difficult role, but you are sitting in between the business and the regulator, the law and the practice, and balancing this. There's a huge balancing act the compliance need to perform in balancing the regulatory requirement with that of the growth objectives of the company. Okay? Remember, the board responsibility was to develop prudent profit. So you, as part of it in the same stream, need to support developing sustainable profit. Your job is not to say no to everything. You must say how to do it. If it is no, then how do you make it yes? What controls need to bring in? What support needs to be given? So that is why I always say the compliance officer has to be a consultant physician, not just a mere medical officer. Not a specialist doctor on one particular area. It has to be a consultant physician who knows everything to great extent. Then your job will be easier. And then you can perform a better job. Because you understand business, you understand the regulation. Then you harmonize these two together and tell how to do it better. No way that you can compromise the regulatory requirements in the eyes of the business. No. You got to balance this act. Get both done equally. And help them to say, okay, what is the meaning? Why is that? What does this interpret? What does this tell? That's a very delicate act, difficult act, a balancing act, right? So these are the requirements of compliance. We are discussing the role of compliance, right? And if there's change to be done to a policy, of course, you need to immediately bring it to the notice of the parties concerned, and maybe to the board, maybe to also to the management, and tell, okay, this is a new requirement, so we have to amend our policy, we have to amend our procedure. That type of proactive involvement of compliance is necessary to develop that compliance culture within the organization. When you are doing that, the business will develop confidence on you. Business will not hate you. Because the compliance in another department always come and say no, 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 no to everything. No, don't do this, don't do this, you can't do this. No, you must tell how to do it. If it is not how to do that. What blending needs to be brought in. What a different approach that you can use in doing it. That's the compliance role. Right? That's why I say it's not easy. It's a difficult role, but nevertheless, it's a very important role. Very, very important for a compliant bank which will have their profitability also in place. Right. Then the provide managers, next slide, 13. With guidance in the development, implementation, and maintenance of policies, procedures, and practices regarding the regulated activity. This is what I have been explaining. Right? So you have to guide the managers. You have to guide them. In doing what? With regard to the development. Development of what? Development of policies, procedures, and practices. Implementation of policies, procedures, and practices. Maintenance of policies, procedures, and practices. So you have to guide them in doing all three. Development, implementation, and maintenance of policies, procedures, which are the ones that pave way for the policy to be met, requirement to be met, and on the regulated activity. So that's the compliance role. To provide training on key compliance and regulatory matters such as complaints, anti-money laundering, conflict resolution, etc. Very important. Training. One of the greatest responsibility of compliance is to train your staff to do business in a compliant manner. AML CFT regime requirements comes and sits on top, obviously. Obviously. Because training has been made compulsory by law. What training? AML training. Anti-money laundering related training has been made compulsory by law, which you don't find for any other area in the industry of banking. Only exception being, that's again not training, some qualification. For treasury operations, the regulation says you need to have the people in treasury operations who have this qualification. Still they don't talk about training. They say how qualification has to be there for them to be deployed in the treasury deal. But AML CFT is quite totally different. Remember, I can't think of any area in banking or in non-banking where there's legal compulsion to train people, except for in anti-money laundering and financing or combating financing of terrorism. But the section 14, which compares the bank to appoint a compliance officer under the duties of compliance officer. Yeah, they have listed in the law itself that the compliance need to make sufficient awareness about the AML, CFT regulations and the requirements among all the staff members of the bank. And therefore, AML training is not just a training, it is a regulatory requirement which have been casted upon on the compliance officer, thereby indirectly casted upon on the bank to provide for all staff on AML. Clear? So we are talking about the responsibility of the compliance officer. Training is a must. Anti-money training, laundering training, And in addition to that, the complaint resolution, which is stemming from the customer charter that have been direction issued by Central Bank, Bank Supervision, and the Customer Protection Act charter issued by the non-bank supervision. More or less the same. Two different names. The non-banks, it came rather late, maybe about 2 years ago, but the banks one came 6 years ago. Customer charter, 6 or 7 years ago. 2018, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 6 years, right? Right? So that providing training and the conflict resolution is the responsibility of the compliance department, division. To implement and maintain compliance monitoring program is another very important one, right? So different banks may call it differently. You say compliance checks, the compliance verifications, right? So you need to have a implement and maintain a compliance monitoring program. You need to have a compliance program for the year, right? All the compliance divisions need to have a compliance program, like the audit program, risk program. So those are called the planned activities for the year under compliance. You have to have a program to say, okay, we are carrying out, X number of compliance checks in branches on the basis of at least 3 branches are covered from each region, whatever it is, you can name it. But the compliance program has to be there, right? To carry out a compliance program on the liquidity, carry out a compliance check on the SRR, statutory reserve requirement, then carry out a compliance check on maybe the deposit insurance scheme, right? They carry out a compliance check on the liquidity requirements. So you have to have within your compliance program various items listed and which needs to be submitted beforehand, right? Carry out a compliance check on the outsource activities. And there's a guideline or there's a direction on outsourcing of business operation, whether the bank falls in line with the direction of the outsourced business operation, to carry out a compliance check to see whether they are doing it properly. So the compliance program has to be there, and it has to be, we will discuss this in detail going forward, right? For the time being, remember, implement and maintain a compliance monitoring program within the bank. So you need to have the program, probably submit it to the executive risk management and the board subcommittee and get the approval on it, and then you need to deliver it over the year. Compliance program. Then last, in that slide, to set policies and procedures and propose improvements in the event the monitoring program identifies deficiencies, weaknesses in the existing policies and procedures. Right. Once you carry out the compliance check for the compliance program, right? Then what do you do? Then you identify if there are any gaps, right? If there's an issue, then you identify a risk. Then you analyze it further. You see the procedure is not there. Internal policy is not there. Or the procedure is not there. Policy is there, but in order to meet the policy, there is a procedure to be followed. That procedure has not been laid out properly. Right? Then you call it a procedural deficiency. Procedural effect or a procedural deficiency. Right? Then some cases where the procedures are all there, but then it simply does not happen. That's an operational issue. Operational issue. Right? Sometimes you have, the document is there, but it's not robust enough. Then there are deficiencies in the procedure. Whatever it is, So once you set the policies, either by yourself, which comes under the area that comes under your purview, or by liaising with the other stakeholders if it is not coming directly under your purview but under their purview. But if there's a problem in the policy, you have to work in liaison with them and make sure that those deficiencies, weaknesses in the existing policies and procedures are well identified and bridged and mitigated and gaps are closed. Right? So that's the responsibility of the compliance officer in terms of the policies. And then to provide regular and accurate reports to the management on regulatory and compliance matters. Right? Can you remember right at the beginning we said under the certain key functions the compliance need to do, there was something to, he said escalation and reporting. And at that time I said some of the reports are escalated internally, some are escalated directly outward. Some are escalated to outward through internal. Right? Okay. So different segment. To provide regular and accurate reports to the management on regulatory and compliance matters. So the compliance has to provide through their compliance checks, monitoring, and all these type of initiatives, they need to report their observations and the findings, right, to the management on a regular basis, right? That is what happens through the ERMC mostly, right? Some of you all said, okay, there was an Executive Risk Management Committee, right? Through that, you bring those issues for discussion at the ERMC, right? Now here, the important thing to have to remember. Now your reporting line is to the board, right? And you are going to report it to the board if there are any issues. Okay? And you are independent. Okay. So you can go and report to board, no problem. Because you are independent, your reporting line is there. You don't need to get approval from CEO to go and report something to the board if you think it's fit and proper. But this is not hora police. Right? Now, board can't come and if there's a problem or some deficiency or some corrections to be done, board can't practically come and do the correction. Why all this is done? In order to rectify the issues, in order to bridge gaps, in order to resolve issues. Then what happens is, though your reporting line is directly onto them, it is always better and suggests that you do the reporting through the internal parties concerned so that they become aware of the deficiency. They become aware of the gap. And it's being discussed with them very openly. There's a problem like this. There's a process error or a process deficiency where the process needs to be strengthened or the gap needs to be done. So, but there are many other cases where the process is perfect, but those are human errors. Willfully done, not willingly done, right? Or done through ignorance, done with due to lack of knowledge, right? So it can be whatever it is. This needs to be brought up and discussed at the ERMC. We call it the Executive Risk Management Committee or some internal forum where all the stakeholders are being told about this issue, enabling them to know that there's an issue, B, to support them on it, 3, to have them rectified. To have them rectified. That's the important one. You need to have them rectified. So if you want to do it, have it rectified, you need to do the transactions immediately or the corrections immediately so that then it will be rectified. So reporting and doing the rectification to coordinate and assist other controls and the risk function in order to comprehensively identify, assess, and manage regulatory. Right? So you have to coordinate and assist the other controls and the risk function. Right? Two things, other controls and the risk function. I think what they are meaning is to support them, other stakeholders, to bridge those gaps by giving you advice, expertise, and all that. Then you are supporting the senior management and establishing and maintaining a good relationship with the regulator. Next point. Right? Because you are the main contact point between the regulator and the bank. Compliance officer. Main contact point. So again, functioning as a conduit. Right? So you are the person who deals directly with the regulator. When I say I'm referring all of you to the compliance officer, so tantamount to the compliance staff. Anybody has a query?
Yes, please. Shall I disturb you for a second, sir?
Yeah, please ask your question.
Yeah, actually, it's regarding the second point that you have highlighted here. It says that comprehensively identify. What is the definition? This is about in comprehensively.
Which slide is that you are referring to?
Present slide. Now you are having the second.
No, I thought we were discussing the slide number 14, right? Is that right?
Yes, correct.
The second point to say to coordinate and assist other controls and the risk functions in order to comprehensively identify, assess, and manage regulatory. Is that the point you are referring to?
Yes, it says that comprehensively identify. What is you are elaborating on comprehensively identify means?
Yes. Now we will take it in full to coordinate and assist other controls and the risk function in order to comprehensively identify, assess, and manage the regulatory risk. Now say comprehensively means completely, in full, holistically. That's the meaning. Okay. What does it mean? Now you understand the regulations. At least you ought to understand the regulation no second to anybody within the organization, because you are the first one to be served the regulation. You are the first one to be part with the regulations by the central bank next to CEO, and it's your duty to learn or study it and interpret and convey it down the line, identify the gaps, either by yourself or in license or in conjunction with the relevant process owner. You got to identify the existing gaps in when a new regulation or some change in the regulation is issued. Correct? So you are supposed to have a very comprehensive bird's eye on the requirement as well as the existing framework. If there's a gap or some deficiency occurs or stemming due to the new circular issued, you need to know exactly more than anybody else within the organization that there's a gap or some issue like this. Correct? That's why the word comprehensively is used there. Coordinate and assist the controls, other controls means other business verticals, the process verticals, and the risk function. Especially mention the risk function. Which is again an independent function within the organization in order to comprehensively identify. First you identify. You exactly identify what exactly the problem is. Then you need to measure. The same principle, assess, right? And then you know where the regulatory risk is here in this problem. Okay? So okay, when you say this, I think my mind goes down my memory lane. I don't know whether you all were there handling this function. There was an account called SIA, Security Investment Account, introduced some time back by the regulator. Right? When this account was introduced, he said, okay, all the remittances coming for investments in Sri Lanka need to be routed through this SIA account. Okay. And they were given the benefit of taking the benefits back without any question being asked. Okay. So all the credits to the SIA account, as per the regulation, needs to come from either by way of a direct remittance coming straight from a foreign jurisdiction to this account, or the other type of credits that can go into the SIA account were the benefits or the returns made out of those so-called investments made by the whoever who is from outside. Returns pertains to that can also go in as a credit to that account. That was the regulation. Okay, that was the regulation. But at the same time, different customers had different SIA accounts at different banks for some reason, right? Then sometimes say you say there's an investment coming into the country to invest in stocks, shares of a company, right? So that goes to the SIA, fine, okay. Then you get various returns coming by way of dividends, and then different types of returns are. So those returns also can go into this account technically. Okay. Now, when such a credit comes into this account, there are a whole heap of practical problems faced by the bankers to identify whether what is the principal investment from which this return occurs. Because the return comes by way of a SWIFT transaction. It goes and just simply lands in this account. Understand? I'm talking to you who raised the question. I'm just bringing them and for the rest of the audience also. Okay. Now, return out of that investment which came through the SIA can be credited to this account. But likewise, you get whole heap of, internal remittances coming into these accounts, and banks were basically very unable to identify whether it can be related to an initial investment which was made through the same SIA. You understand the problem now? Hello? Are you all with me?
Yes,
Audience, I'm just taking this example. Okay. So it was extremely practically a difficult situation for the banks to handle. Because the way, especially in this, today's the electronic environment where the payment channels are very effective, and then the accounts are getting credited without any human involvement. When they run their diskette, the credits come and lands into the account, right? So suppose if there had been a credit to which on a subsequent inquiry, if we can't prove, because this happens when the owner of the account holder wants to take this money back, sometimes they are not getting clearance, because then they are asked to prove that this investment came through this. Then the banks will be liable for allowing it. So these are certain, it doesn't happen every day and every time, every other day, but this type of situations do occur. Then who is there to support the business? Who is there to interpret this problem? Who is there to go back to the regulator and convey the practical problems the banks are faced with? That's the compliance role. That's the compliance role. Right? So again, I can make some reference that 200,000 third-party deposit. Initially, when it came, it didn't have a limit. It didn't have a flow limit. It said any third-party deposit needs to have all this information. Then it was a bit of a difficult thing for the bank to practice. Any deposit, even if it's a 10,000 deposit made by third party, Now say I can go and deposit to my son's account, something. The wife can deposit to the husband's account, something, right? But these are small deposits. Okay. So that also came under that scrutiny of the microscope. So it is an extremely difficult and heavily burdened administrative task for the bank. So then we, as compliance, we went and had a discussion with the regulator and explained the thing. And then they understood, agreed, and then only they set the limit to 200 or 200,000. I can't remember because 200,000 during my time. Right? So this is the involvement the compliance has to make to support the business, to interpret the regulation, to explain it to the business, maybe to go back to the regulation. Sometimes it might not know exactly the practical problems faced by the bank. But CR issue, I mean, it continued to stay there because they had their own issues in somehow controlling it. Otherwise, there were some chances for the foreign currency to be misused. But the bank had that problem. Then we had to resort to various other, internal checks. What we did was, I think we parked, we named those accounts and then identified them in the system and got the IT support and all credits. We blocked any credit to that account and to lay it in a kind of a quarantine area. Right? So to do this, compliance has to involve themselves. Right? Compliance can't just say, okay, there is the regulation, just follow it. I mean, just you're gone. Then you are not doing your job properly. You got to take the pain by yourself and be party to it and try and go and solve it for the company, for the bank, by working hand in hand with the business, work hand in hand with the IT, and at the same time to bring this to the notice of the board well in ahead. Okay, there's a new regulation that are coming. We are having these issues. We are having these gaps in our system. We are liaising with them. Right? We are in the process of sorting this out, but it's going to be take a time. It's a journey. All that can happen. Okay. Another example, the KYC. I mean, there were legacy accounts. KYC came into play later. Maybe in initially it came into play in, if I remember right, somewhere in maybe 2003 or 4 initially. Right? But how it was really implemented was somewhere down maybe 2010 or 2008-9. Right? So then most of the large banks had a legacy accounts, huge number of accounts without KYC. So the regulation does not permit you to have any account without KYC. So it was a journey. It was a long journey to get them also on board. Right? So you got to tell the board there's a new regulation like this, which covers the entire set of accounts. But we have this number of accounts where the KYC has not been taken in this manner. So it's a journey. We are working on it. So you've got to give even the regulator, you can't say, no, we have this account, therefore we can't do no. That's not the answer. You got to, work with them, make them understand, work closely, have that understanding, manage the relationship, manage the regulator, and manage your own staff, and have some processes in place to get the KYC for the legacy accounts. I'm just giving you a few examples, right? So that's the compliance role. That's what I say. It's not easy. That's what I'm saying. It's supplementary and complementary to do business. You can't simply say, no, that is a requirement. You better do it the way you like. How you are going to do it is not my problem. You can't say that. Then you lose confidence by the business process vertical process owners. Then only the problem starts. Easy to say something, but difficult to do it. You need to pave the way and be part and parcel of the game. You need to be a player in that and help them doing it. Tell them the way to do it. Guide them to do it. That's your role. Right? So here again, coming back to your specific question, in order to comprehensively identify. So with that knowledge, again, my example of being a consultant physician will give you and pave the way for you to understand the problem in a comprehensive manner more than anybody else, because you know the requirement, you know the regulation, and you know the subject also. That you ought to know. Then you can comprehensively identify the issue. Then with them you can assess it, and then only you can manage the regulatory risk if there are any. Have I answered your question now?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. It's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right. To support senior management in establishing and maintaining good relationship with the regulator. Right? To support the senior management and establishing and maintaining good relationship, you have to have the, because you are the conduit. You got to, you know the regulator, you know whom to speak, you know who is doing what there, and you have to develop that relationship, a very professional relationship with the regulator. So you cannot go and challenge the regulator, you need to manage the regulator. So you need to assist your senior management to do that. So we will discuss how to handle the regulator. That's also coming as part in the latter part of this session. I'll give you more kind of insights into it. So for the time being, just remember, you have to support the senior management in establishing and maintaining good relationship with the regulator. Then the function, to function as the main contact point, that's what I said. Regulator, when they are sending something, they straight away send to CEO and to the compliance officer, not to anybody else. So it is the compliance officer to disseminate that information. Mere forwarding the information is not sufficient, which is you know, at times happening, which is not the proper way. You need to understand exactly what it is. So you need to function as the main contact point between the institution and the relevant regulators. You are the main person. They will liaise with you, you will liaise with the other party, and you are in the middle. So you do it for the benefit of both the sides. You understand exactly what the regulator wants, and you would deliver that. Otherwise, what happens is regulator will want something else, the bank will deliver something else. But you are being the person in between, in the middle, need to understand what exactly the regulator. If it is not clear, you will talk to them and ask what exactly you need. I remember there was some time where certain regulators, now in the central bank, also different departments. Sometimes the economic research asks for some information, then they certain regional level information, they write to the regional, and the regional managers sending some of the agri-based information, if I remember right? How many loans have been granted to this particular sector, and how much have been granted, how much is NP, and how much are revolving, all that type of information that is necessary for them to make various decisions. Right. Now, different regional officers would interpret it differently, and they would send different figures. When these figures go from different regional officers, sometimes it's not telling with the bank total figure. So, at a mess, right? So that's the reason why you are in the middle. So if they want something, they will ask from you, or even they ask something because you can't go and change the regulator. Sometimes, mostly the regulator, all the very actively involving departments always do it through that. But there can be a department, some special reason may write direct to a particular unit. But internally, you need to frame your processes in place. Any information to outsiders need to go through compliance division. Finish. So internal process has been put in place. So nobody will reply without routing it through you. So I'm just giving you certain examples. The importance of you functioning as the main contact point. Right? All such information will come. So you have a duty to go through that information and make sure whether you are giving the right information, whether these are tallying with your base records, Are there any disparities? If that is the case, you need to cleanse the information. Understand? So it's you know, your role is so big. It's so big. It's not a question of taking the regulation from one side and putting it through another circular or some forwarding. These are central bank regulations, just follow. No, that's not the role of compliance. It's much bigger, right? That's what I say, that task is extremely difficult, one of the difficult most tasks. And I say it because I have handled it. I handled many functions, and this is one of the difficult most tasks, but you have to do it. That's the role of compliance, right? So I think it's time up for today. So we have discussed up to the 14th slide here. Any questions up to this point?
Sir, excuse me, sir. For procedures, do we need to get the approval from the board of directors as well for procedures?
No, not really. It can be sanctioned through your, it's not a must. Generally, the procedures are not put to the board for approval. The policies are put to the board for approval. Thereafter, once the procedures are framed, that can be discussed with the relevant officers, the parties, and of course, it has to be sanctioned by the internal departments. Like maybe the procedure comes from the treasury, but it has to be routed through departments like audit, risk, compliance, for sure, because they also will go through it to see whether there are any flaws, problems, deficiencies, issues that can come through that. In addition to the process owner, at least these three departments need to vet the document, and then ideal way of doing that is put it to the internal risk committee, which is known as the executive risk management committee. So before it puts into practice, executive risk management committee is chaired by the MD CEO in most banks, because it's such an important committee, because it's a kind of a mirror reflection of what goes to the board risk committee. So all the papers and reports that goes to the board risk committee is technically and practically discussed in the executive risk committee, right? Now, some people get the wrong impression because you have a direct reporting line to board. You can go and report anything and everything to board, like you're doing hide and seek and Nora police, because without telling the parties concerned that there's an issue like this. It's totally conceptually wrong, because the reporting to board is one aspect, but main requirement of identifying and assessing, measuring, and reporting is to rectify this. The rectification can be done only by the process owner or the parties concerned with it, right? Unless it's a very confidential matter where there's a fraud or something, or whether this is something like the STR, you don't go and discuss these things. These are very exceptional situations. STR, you know, suspicious transaction, you don't go and discuss. But if you find any causes for that, such a situation that occurs for the rise of STR, then of course, without highlighting the particular issue, you can go down to the desk and then get them to frame their processes and put them in place properly. That's a different story. But other than that, any other issue comes up, needs to be discussed there. So your question is, you're asking me whether it needs to go to the board. Not necessary, unless the board wanted it for a very specific reason. Otherwise, not necessary. It can be approved by internally. And the best way is to get it sanctioned at the executive risk committee. So everybody, all the key personnel, MPs are represented there. So nobody can say we didn't know. So that's the best way to do. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions? No. Okay, right. So we will wind up for today and probably meet up at the next Sunday. Or next Sunday, is it a POA day? Is next Sunday a POA day?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, probably we might not have classes in that case, so IBSL will advise you. very likely that we will not have classes on the Poya day. Then it will be the Sunday after next. So go through this. If you have any queries, you can always refer them to me. Make your notes in future also. The TUT does not give you a comprehensive, knowledge and information about the requirements. You got to make your notes. So we'll meet up on that day. And until then, good luck to all. Thank you.